Welcome to Living Word Ministries with our director and Bible teacher, Debbie Blank. Debbie's passion is for you to understand and apply God's truths to your life. Now let's listen and enjoy teaching from the Word of God with Debbie Blank.
Because in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7, it says, "After this I kept looking in the night visions." Again, Daniel is searching. "And behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying." Now, when you think of terrifying, Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to be a very terrifying king. Was he ever described as that way, though? No. This beast is described that way. What terrifies you today? ISIS. You know, the idea of somebody coming in and beheading you just because you're a believer. I mean, that's pretty terrifying. Never had that thought before, but now it's possible. I mean, it's not as probable right in the United States right now, but it is possible, and it was never possible before. So you just think of the most terrifying thing you can think of, and that's what's going to be replicated through this beast. Dreadful, terrifying, extremely strong. So this beast is going to have military force. Now we know that Rome was extremely strong, and Rome was terrifying. That's why they crucified people. That was something that they developed, and it was a terrifying way to die. It had large teeth, large iron teeth. All right, so these iron teeth could be the idea of the iron legs here, matching up with chapter 2. It goes on to say that it devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. Now, have we seen those feet of the statue in play yet? No, we have not. So when we're looking at the fourth beast, this may be a mixture of the old Roman Empire and the future one, or we could have been talking about the early Roman Empire, and now when it's talking about devouring, crushing, trampling down the remainder with its feet, it could be talking about the future one. It says, "And it was different from all the other beasts were before it, and it had 10 horns." So did you catch that? It was different than all the rest. In Daniel chapter 2, it never gives us any idea that the legs of iron are any different than the rest of the statue. They're all part of it. But this beast is different, giving us the idea that we're looking here at the future part of the Roman Empire, the final aspect. Now, the Roman Empire, when did it fall? As some people will say, it fell in 476, when Rome actually fell. But others will tell you it never really fell until Constantinople fell to the Turks, which then that city became Istanbul. So they'll tell you that even then, there's so much of the Roman Empire that's ingrained in the world that it really never fell completely. It just kind of shifted around because Europe is still there, and Europe was the predominance of the Roman Empire, and it's still there, and it's still in power. So we could be talking about this final beast being, the fourth beast here, being that final empire that's an offshoot of the Roman Empire. The only way we can know the difference between the old Roman Empire and the future one is how? When Jesus comes, at the timing of the return of Jesus. When we're talking about the timing of the return of Jesus and what's going to happen with that, then we know we're talking about the new Roman Empire. Very good. We also know, if we can prove it's happened, we know it's talking about the old. If we can't prove it's happened yet, we'd be talking about the new. All right, now let's talk about the 10 horns. Well, no, let's not talk about them yet. We're just giving the description. I'll give you the understanding as we get going. Now it says in verse 8, "While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts." This one's going to be explained later on, so I'm not going to explain it now. But just imagine this. You've got 10 kings, 10 horns, right? Then you have another one, so you have 11 horns. but 3 are pulled out. So now wait a minute. I forgot to add the one. So now you have how many horns? 8 horns. Okay, that's important. Now because of this, people were waiting for the European Union to be formed. When it was formed in 1957 at the Treaty of Rome, everybody thought that's it. As soon as they hit 10 states, the Antichrist is going to rise, because they were waiting for Rome to be revived. Well, they hit 10 states, and the Antichrist didn't arise. And then they even, they hit 11, and he still didn't arise. And now they have how many? 28. 28 member states, at least right now. That may change with Greece, but 28 member states in the European Union. So that doesn't fit with the idea of the 10 horns here. So, getting sidetracked. Let me go on and then we'll explain this a little bit more. Now we've seen Daniel's vision. The first 3 we explained. This 4th one we're going to wait to explain because it is explained for us. What do these 4 beasts represent? Again, 4 kingdoms. Has the Babylonian kingdom come and gone? Has the Medo-Persian kingdom come and gone? Has the Greece kingdom come and gone? Okay, so this is past history so far. Now, when we get to the 4th kingdom, or the 4th beast, Rome has come and gone, the old ancient Rome, but has the final Roman kingdom come and gone? It has not. So this is still future, dealing with the 4th beast. By the way, some of you are wondering why we're talking about the Roman Empire having to be revived in the last days before the return of Jesus. That answer will come in Daniel chapter 9. But I don't want to spoil that and take our time tonight. So we'll just continue to move on here, and then you can join us for Daniel chapter 9 to find the answer to that. I never pull things out of the hat when it comes to the Bible. When I'm explaining things and giving you current events, I obviously give you what's going on in the world. But we don't ever want to just guess at the Bible. We can either know by other scriptures, or we just decide we can't know. Because there are some things we can't always understand. And that's when we go to Deuteronomy 29:29. Remember that? The secret things belong to the Lord. Now this gives you an example of the statue of Daniel 2 on the left and the 4 beasts on the right. Obviously the lion corresponding with the head of gold, Babylon. The bear with the silver, Medo-Persia. The leopard with the bronze, Greece. And finally, the dreadful and terrifying beast. And I love the way this picture is, because that beast encompasses both the legs and the toes. And the 4th beast, the 4th part of the statue, is the Roman Empire. The feet and toes are an outgrowth of the Roman Empire that's still future. So that's just an example of the comparison there. By the way, if you want a copy of this, just email me and I'll send you a copy of this PowerPoint. I'm glad you said that, and I'm going to reiterate exactly what I said because I want you all to hear it. It is a very strong possibility that what he says is accurate. We don't know for sure if the view of this matching up with Daniel 2, or whether it matches up with what he said. But what he said is that it's a strong belief that the lion represents, first of all, that these kingdoms represent the kingdoms in existence at the time of the Antichrist, at the time that Jesus is going to return. So that the lion represents England, with the 2 wings, which would be England and America, because we are an offshoot of that. Then he says that the bear represents Russia, and we know the bear is an example of Russia. And the 3 teeth, the 3 ribs, represent territories that they have confiscated. Then you look at the leopard, and the leopard with the 4 heads represents Germany. Thank you. Germany. Yeah, he mentions that the German tanks were called the Panthers. But he mentioned specifically with Germany that the Germans have had 3 wars. Obviously, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Prussian War before that. And then I don't know what the 4th wing would stand for. But anyway, remember that Hitler called himself the Third Reich. So it's very possible that these represent kingdoms at the time of the Antichrist, which would make it easier to understand then that this dreadful and terrifying beast is the final world empire. He equated it with Islam. I would see that that's a possibility also, because remember, this dreadful and terrifying beast is different than all the others. The others are countries. Islam is a religion and a Sharia law. I mean, all their law and all their religion and their nationality and their country, their heritage is Islam. So they're everything wrapped up in one, which makes them totally different than other nations. So that's a very strong possibility too. Either way, we're talking about the Gentile nations in the past or in the present before the time of the judgment and the return of Christ. So whether we're far past nations or whether we're recent nations, they're still nations that are bringing us up to this end time period. Over here. Okay. She said there's a book out now called The Rise of the Fourth Reich, which could be the fourth idea of the fourth wing. Grace, did you have your hand up? Okay. Yes. What's the common language? English. Right. The lion, English. Good. So you've got two possibilities there. It's very difficult to understand which is which. If you compare Scripture to Scripture, we would think that it matches up with the statue, especially when we get to chapter 8. But it's possible that what Z said is absolutely right. The fact is, us understanding which Gentile nations are in control isn't as important as what's going to happen with this final beast and the ushering in of the return of Christ. That's the most important aspect of this. The point of the beast tells us that the Gentile nations controlled the land of Israel, because this is all about Israel. This is all about the Jews, that they would be the Gentile nations controlling Israel. We know that England controlled Israel. We know right now that the United States and Germany have a great play in controlling Israel, and we know Islam is controlling Israel in many ways, because 4.5 million of the citizens in Israel are Muslims. Well, they're Palestinians, and most of those are Muslims. So it's very possible. I'm open to either one. That's not as important to me as understanding what happens hereafter. And the hereafter is the Ancient of Days. After this dreadful and terrifying beast is mentioned, at least in the dream, that he's a boastful person and arrogant, it says in verse 9, I kept looking until thrones were set up. And the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. Let's stop here for a minute before we go on. It says here, thrones were set up. What does that tell you? What's going to happen? What happens when you have thrones? Okay, you have kingdoms. All right? Well, let's move on a little bit, because then it says, it describes whom here? Who is the Ancient of Days? God. It says here, his vesture, his garment is like white snow. What do you think of when you think of white? Purity, moral purity, just complete purity and righteousness. And the hair of his head was pure wool also. But then, and then when you think of that, you think of wisdom. Proverbs 20:29 says, the honor of old men is their gray hair, because of their wisdom. So when you think of this, you think of the wisdom God has. But at the end of verse 9 it says, his throne was ablaze with flames, its wheels were a burning fire. What do you think of when you think of fire or flames? Judgment. Judgment. So we've got here, now you think of power, because fire is very powerful, and you also think of judgment. Now when you think of, well, let's go on to verse 10. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were open. All right, that's pretty clear as to what's going to happen. And what is it that's going to happen? Judgment. Now let's get an idea of this. Let's get an idea of the timing here. Let's turn to Revelation 5. Revelation 5 in the context is before the tribulation starts. It's chapter 4 is all about God on his throne. Chapter 5 is about Jesus coming before God to get a book or a scroll that's going to start the tribulation period. It tells us in Revelation 5:11, I looked and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands. We're looking at the exact same language here when it talks about the Ancient of Days. And then when he says the court sat and the books were open, you just go a little bit back in Revelation 5 where it says in verse 1, I saw on the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals. And a strong angel proclaimed, who is worthy to open and break its seal? No one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the book. I began to weep, John says, because no one was found worthy to open the book or to look into it. One of the elders said to me, stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals. That's pretty exciting. I love that passage there. We have God seated on the throne, and he's got a book, and he's going to give that book to Jesus to open. So you might say that the court sat and that the books were open. Everything in the scroll was open. So you see God ready to bring judgment. Now the 7 years of the tribulation is not a specific judgment like the Bema Seat judgment or the Great White Throne judgment. God doesn't sit down with the people when it starts and judge everybody individually. Instead, it's 7 years of wrath, 7 years of judgment that's going to take place during the tribulation period. All designed to give people an opportunity to turn to the true Messiah. That's what's going to happen. Now let's look at verse 11 to continue on. We have an idea of God here, seated on his throne. The courts are opened. I forgot to mention to you too, back when it talks about the thrones were set up, let's turn to Matthew 19:29 because it may make you wonder what multiple thrones are. Does anybody have any ideas? Let's see what Matthew says. Matthew 19:28 says, in Jesus' own words, truly I say to you that you who have followed me, in the regeneration when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So multiple thrones could be a response, a fulfillment of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 19. What I'm seeing here is that we have a sequence of events that are going in a timetable. We have the Gentile nations. We have the coming of a dreadful and terrifying king. Then we have God who says, okay, it's time. And he sits on his court and the book is opened. And when the book is given to Jesus, that starts the 7-year period of tribulation. With that idea, let's continue because Daniel 7:11 and 12 goes on to say, then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words, the pride, the arrogant words, which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. Now, who do we think this beast is? Who do we think this little horn is? The Antichrist. In the Bible, the Antichrist is never used for a person. It's used, that statement is used for a philosophy. Anyone who denies Jesus Christ. Because of that philosophy, we have equated the final world ruler to the name Antichrist. But if you do a research on it, you won't find him listed. You'll find him listed as many things in the Bible. He's called the prince who is to come. Here he's called the little horn. In chapter 11, he's called a king. He's called many things in the Bible. Antichrist isn't one of them. That's just how we describe him. So keep that in mind. So this tells us that the books are opened. And then at some point after the books are open, the Antichrist is going to be slain. And he's going to be destroyed and given to the burning fire. Let's look over at Revelation chapter 19. And again, we're getting the understanding of the vision, then we're going to get the explanation. But in Revelation chapter 19, this is the chapter where Jesus returns in the sequence of the 7-year tribulation period. It tells us in Revelation 19:20, the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. So when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to be sent into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is Gehenna. That's eternal hell. Not a temporary place. He's judged and he's sent there for all eternity. Now keep that theme in mind, because as we move on to verse 12, it says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away. The idea is that they were conquered, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. So if this is talking about Gentile nations in general, referenced by the statue, or if it's talking about the specific nations that Z mentioned, we're still talking about the Gentile nations. They're not destroyed when the Antichrist is destroyed. Why? Do you have any idea why they wouldn't be destroyed? Now, their armies are, because Revelation 19, verse 21 says, the rest who were arming with the Antichrist were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of Christ, who sat upon his horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. So the armies will be destroyed. But as far as the kingdoms go, it says here, they lose their dominion. They're no longer in authority, but they're granted life for a appointed period of time. What period of time would that be? The millennial kingdom. Why would God allow them to go into the millennial kingdom? We know biblically, and this is another time, discussion for another time, that the only people who will enter the millennial kingdom will be believers, not unbelievers. So either the people in these kingdoms were believers and they were granted an appointed time, or God wasn't finished with them yet. This is still referencing the time during the time of the beast, or the time of the Antichrist. Okay, he said, good point, that Revelation says the Antichrist was thrown in there alive. Here it says the beast was slain, and his body was destroyed and given to the kingdom, or given to the burning fire. So could this be talking about the kingdom instead of the king with that? And since it talks about the rest of the kingdoms in verse 12, it could be relating to the rest of the kingdoms were allowed to continue for a period of time, but not the kingdom of the Antichrist. A period of time until Christ was going to actually return. Because timing-wise, in verse 13, what happens? Jesus comes. The Son of Man comes. It says in verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming. And he came up, and when we say was coming, we automatically think that that's the second coming when he comes back at the end of the tribulation period. But that's not the timing here. Because here it says he was coming and he came up to the Ancient of Days. So he was coming to the Ancient of Days, he wasn't coming back to the earth. And he was presented before him. That matches up with Revelation 5. And to him was given dominion, authority, rulership, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So here we see a timing that we've got the Ancient of Days sitting in the courts that could very well be the beginning of the tribulation period. Because Jesus then comes and goes to the Ancient of Days. And then after he goes to the Ancient of Days, at some period thereafter, he's given dominion and takes that dominion later. Now, that may be a little confusing because you might think, well, he's going before the Ancient of Days, he's given dominion, he immediately starts reigning in his kingdom. But that's not the case. Turn to Revelation 11. Because timing of Revelation 11 is right in the middle of the tribulation period, 3.5 years into the middle of the tribulation period. And it tells us in verse 15, right at that middle point, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. Well, if you read that, you think, okay, Christ is coming right here. But he's not. He doesn't come for 3.5 more years. What has happened is the end has started. The idea is that Christ has begun his reign, but before he can do that, he must fulfill the wrath of God in order to get to the reign and the millennial kingdom. So even though it looks like Christ is coming right here in Revelation, he's not. He's not coming for 3.5 years. Even though it looks like Christ is coming here because it says it, he's coming to the Ancient of Days. Then once the wrath of God takes place, 7 years, then Christ will come and reign in his kingdom. Is that completely confusing to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, question is, when the Ancient of Days comes and courts are set up, is this in the earth or is this in heaven? If it matches with Revelation 5, it's in heaven. Okay? The courts are set up in heaven. Let's turn to John 5 to finish answering that. Because what John 5 tells us is that God gives authority to Jesus to judge. In verse 22 it says, "For not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to the Son." Then if you look at verse 27, he says, "And he gave Jesus authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." So God's setting up the courts. Jesus is coming before him to be given the authority to execute the judgment. But that doesn't mean it's going to happen right then. It's the start of the judgment. I see this judgment as being 7 years long, culminating with the return of Jesus Christ. Now, do you see why it's important to understand that time frame that I showed you earlier? We have the Gentile nations. We have the Antichrist. We have God on the throne giving Jesus the book in Revelation 5 that may well match up with here, which starts the judgment of 7 years that will continue for 7 years until Jesus returns and establishes his millennial kingdom.
Thank you for joining us today on Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank. Living Word Ministries is a listener-supported program. To contact Debbie Blank, you may do so at livingwordministry.org. Please tune in each week at the same time for Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank.